July 4th, 1894. Under the blazing summer sun, thousands of heavily armed federal troops marched directly into the city of Chicago. They were not deployed to repel a foreign invasion, but to crush the starving American workers who built the world's most luxurious railcars. By sunset, bayonets clashed with flesh, blood spilled onto the iron tracks, and the economic lifeblood of an entire nation ground to a violent halt. This was the brutal undoing of the Pullman Palace Car Company. At its zenith, this corporate empire held an absolute 100% monopoly over luxury rail travel in America, ruling a magnificent 12,000-resident private town designed to control every breath its workers took. Yet the grand industrial utopia dissolved into a dystopian nightmare. The thundering factories fell cold, the corporate citadel was completely dismantled by the courts, and an empire that once defined American industrial supremacy vanished entirely from the earth. How did a corporate empire built on the promise of perfect harmony and worker welfare ignite the most explosive labor war of the 19th century? What fatal boardroom missteps and stubborn refusal to adapt to a changing world doomed a global pioneer to a slow, agonizing death? From the opulent, velvet-lined streets of Chicago, Illinois, to the rusted, forgotten ruins of Butler, Pennsylvania, this is the century-long saga of the Pullman Company, a devastating chronicle of unparalleled luxury, corporate tyranny, and the ultimate price of industrial hubris. To understand the meteoric rise of the Pullman Empire, one must first look at the sheer brutality of mid-19th century travel. In the 1850s, riding an American train was an exercise in raw physical endurance. Passengers sat on hard wooden benches inside cramped, poorly ventilated wooden boxes. Industrial soot blasted through open windows, caking clothing and burning eyes. The tracks were uneven, causing violent, unpredictable jolts that made sleep a functional impossibility. Long-distance journeys left travelers bruised, exhausted, and covered in grime. It was a miserable, democratic suffering. Enter George Mortimer Pullman. A shrewd businessman with a background in structural engineering, Pullman recognized a massive, untapped market void. He realized that while the Industrial Revolution was rapidly minting a new class of ultra-wealthy tycoons, the transportation infrastructure still treated them like cattle. Pullman envisioned something radical: a hotel on wheels, a rolling palace that would transform travel from a torturous chore into an exquisite luxury experience. In 1864, despite widespread skepticism from traditional railroad executives, Pullman invested his life savings into constructing a prototype car named the Pioneer. The Pioneer was an engineering marvel, but it was also a massive corporate gamble. Built at a staggering cost of $18,000, nearly 4 times the cost of a standard railcar at the time, it featured polished walnut paneling, thick velvet curtains, French mirrors, and plush carpeting. However, it possessed a fatal flaw. It was simply too wide and too tall to clear existing railroad platforms and bridges. For months, the Pioneer sat idle in a Chicago yard, deemed an expensive, unmarketable white elephant by an industry stubbornly resistant to change. Then, history intervened through a shattering national tragedy. In April 1865, the nation was paralyzed by the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. As a grief-stricken country prepared to bid farewell to the martyred leader, a funeral train was organized to carry Lincoln's body across the United States. Recognizing a profound opportunity, Pullman stepped forward and offered the Pioneer to transport the president's family on the final leg of the journey from Chicago to Springfield, Illinois. To accommodate the oversized luxury car, railroad companies and government officials scrambled, working around the clock to shave down existing station platforms and alter low-hanging bridges along the route. As the funeral train crept across the American landscape, millions of citizens lined the tracks in solemn silence. They saw the Pioneer not merely as a piece of machinery, but as a rolling temple of national mourning. Overnight, the name Pullman became deeply woven into the American consciousness, associated forever with a profound sense of dignity, reverence, and unparalleled prestige. With the infrastructure permanently altered to accommodate his cars, Pullman's business exploded. The newly rich tycoons of the Gilded Age, the Rockefellers, Carnegies, and Vanderbilts, demanded nothing less than the Pullman standard. By the 1870s, the Pullman Palace Car Company had established an absolute stranglehold on luxury rail travel. To step inside a Pullman car was to escape the harshness of the expanding American frontier and enter an oasis of absolute opulence. Chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over hand-carved woodwork. Gourmet meals were served on fine china, and at night, upper berths folded down seamlessly to reveal crisp, clean linens. Yet beneath this immaculate facade of gold leaf and velvet lay a volatile, hidden friction. The majestic palace cars did not build themselves. Deep within the industrial heart of Illinois, hundreds of skilled woodworkers, blacksmiths, and mechanics labored in exhausting, hazardous conditions. While passengers sipped champagne in climate-controlled luxury, the men who built the cars endured sweltering heat, deafening machinery, and toxic fumes. They breathed in thick sawdust and heavy metal smoke for hours on end, earning wages that barely allowed their families to survive. This stark, unyielding duality would become the defining trait of the Pullman Empire. The immense wealth and flawless luxury enjoyed by America's elite were fundamentally purchased through the absolute exhaustion and silent sacrifice of an invisible working class. It was a structural tension, a deep and widening fault line built directly into the foundation of the company. As the empire grew larger and more powerful, the weight on that fault line was becoming dangerously unsustainable. By 1880, George Pullman's corporate empire had outgrown its scattered manufacturing facilities in Chicago. The demand for his palace cars was insatiable, but Pullman was troubled by a deeper, systemic anxiety, the rising tide of American labor unrest. He watched with growing alarm as violent strikes paralyzed rival railroad companies, fueled by the squalor and desperation of urban slums. Pullman believed he possessed the intellectual superiority to engineer a permanent solution to the capitalism versus labor conflict. His solution was not to compromise with his workers, but to completely reinvent the environment in which they lived. In 1880, Pullman secretly purchased 4,000 acres of desolate marshland near Lake Calumet, 14 miles south of Chicago. There, he embarked on one of the most ambitious social engineering experiments in human history, the construction of a fully private industrial town named Pullman. He hired a brilliant young architect, Solon Spencer Beeman, and a visionary landscape designer, Nathan Barrett, giving them a singular directive: build a city that is simultaneously a highly efficient manufacturing colossus and a visual masterpiece of civic harmony. The result was a breathtaking red brick metropolis that stunned the industrialized world. At its heart stood the sprawling manufacturing complex, a state-of-the-art facility featuring the monumental Corliss steam engine, the grandest power plant of the age, which drove hundreds of advanced machines churning out thousands of elite passenger cars annually. Surrounding the factories, Beeman erected an immaculate, cohesive community for 12,000 residents. Wide, tree-lined boulevards were illuminated by advanced gas lighting. Elegant brick row houses boasted indoor plumbing, proper ventilation, and private yards, luxuries entirely unheard of for 19th-century industrial laborers. The town center featured the massive arcade, a monumental structure housing a grand theater, a fully stocked library, professional medical offices, and corporate-approved retail stores. Nearby, the majestic greenstone church stood as a towering monument to moral order. International observers, journalists, and foreign dignitaries flocked to Illinois, marveling at the total absence of slums, filth, and chaos. The town of Pullman was universally hailed as the world's most perfect city, a shining beacon of enlightened capitalism where human happiness and corporate efficiency operated in flawless synchronization. George Pullman confidently believed he had engineered a strike-proof society, a permanent testament to his own benevolence. But he had fundamentally miscalculated human nature. He forgot that a gilded cage, no matter how beautifully designed and expertly engineered, is still a cage. The illusion of paradise dissolved the moment one looked beneath the pristine red brick veneer. The town of Pullman was not a community. It was a deeply authoritarian corporate autocracy. George Pullman owned everything. He owned the houses, the streets, the school, the church, the library, the water pipes, and the very dirt beneath the residents' boots. The 12,000 workers and their families did not own a single brick. They were entirely prohibited from buying real estate, ensuring that their shelter was completely dependent on their ongoing submission to the company. Daily life within this industrial utopia was governed by a suffocating web of corporate surveillance and control. George Pullman banned independent newspapers, open town hall meetings, and any form of unapproved political organization. There were no elected officials. The town was ruled entirely by corporate managers. Even the Greenstone Church sat empty for long periods because Pullman demanded a rental fee so exorbitant that local congregations could not afford to preach there. Company spies and inspectors routinely patrolled the neighborhoods, peering through windows and entering homes without warning. A worker could be immediately evicted, fired, and blacklisted across the entire railroad industry for keeping a dirty front yard, uttering a single word of criticism against management, or being caught drinking alcohol outside company-approved hours. Most terrifying of all was the economic mechanism Pullman designed to lock his workforce into total compliance: the payroll loop. The Pullman Palace Car Company operated as two distinct, legally insulated corporate entities: the manufacturing division that paid the workers, and the real estate division that collected rent and utility fees. Every 2 weeks, the laborers did not receive their wages in full to allocate as they saw fit. Instead, the company automatically deducted the rent, gas, and water charges directly from their paychecks before the workers ever touched a single cent. This meant that the company always secured its maximum profit first, leaving the human being to survive on whatever fractions remained. It was a flawless financial trap. Laborers frequently walked away from the paymaster's window holding checks that read 40 cents, 12 cents, or in some documented cases, a single digit of pennies, after their mandatory housing costs were stolen by the corporation. The system was perfectly balanced to extract maximum wealth and enforce absolute obedience as long as the global economy remained stable. But by the early 1890s, an unprecedented economic storm was gathering on the American horizon, ready to test just how much pressure this immaculate capitalist fortress could truly withstand before it fractured from within. In the spring of 1893, the glittering illusion of America's Gilded Age violently fractured. It began with the sudden collapse of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, a shockwave that triggered the worst economic depression the United States had ever witnessed. Within months, over 500 banks closed their doors, more than 15,000 businesses went bankrupt, and unemployment skyrocketed past 20%. The unstoppable American industrial engine suddenly ground to a screeching halt. For the Pullman Palace Car Company, the crisis was immediate and catastrophic. Railroad corporations across the nation canceled their orders for luxury cars overnight, and the steady stream of affluent travelers dried up completely. Faced with a rapidly emptying order book, George Pullman acted with cold, mathematical precision to protect his shareholders and preserve his corporate dividends. He refused to let the economic storm deplete the company's vast treasury. To lower production costs and remain competitive, Pullman ordered a sweeping, brutal reduction across the manufacturing division. Wages were slashed by an average of 25%, and in some specialized departments, skilled craftsmen saw their take-home pay cut by as much as 30 to 40%. It was a standard industrial reaction to a severe depression. However, Pullman's strike-proof utopia possessed an institutional flaw that turned this economic reduction into a humanitarian disaster. While George Pullman drastically reduced the price of labor, he flatly refused to lower the cost of living inside his private town. The rent for the red brick row houses, the fees for gas and water, and the prices at the corporate-owned grocery stores remained frozen at peak pre-depression rates. When a desperate committee of workers pleaded with him to lower their housing costs in proportion to their wage cuts, Pullman cold-bloodedly dismissed their concerns. He argued that the Pullman Palace Car Company and the Pullman Land Association were entirely separate legal and financial entities. As a landlord, he claimed he was legally entitled to a fixed 6% return on his real estate investment, completely independent of the manufacturing market's volatility. This rigid corporate insulation created an unendurable financial trap for the 12,000 residents. The payroll loop became an instrument of outright starvation. Every 2 weeks, laborers stood in long, anxious lines at the paymaster's window, wrapped in thin coats against the biting Illinois wind. The paymaster would open the ledger, calculate the workers' slashed wages, and then immediately deduct the full, unyielding rent and utility fees. Only after the corporation had secured its absolute profit would the remaining balance be pushed through the iron grate to the worker. The results were devastating. Men who had labored 60 hours a week in the sweltering heat of the iron foundries were handed paychecks containing only a fraction of a dollar. Documented corporate ledgers from the winter of 1893 revealed the stark tragedy. After housing deductions, one worker was left with just 60 cents to feed his family for 2 weeks. Another walked away with 11 cents. One infamous check, preserved in historical archives, was made out for the grand total of a single penny. Inside the pristine, uniform brick houses, the reality of the gilded cage turned pitch black. Families huddled together in the dark because they could no longer afford the company's gas fees. Children cried from hunger in immaculate, well-ventilated rooms that international visitors had praised as paradise just months prior. Carts from the corporate store refused to deliver bread to those who could not pay in cash, and company inspectors continued to patrol the streets, threatening immediate eviction for anyone who fell behind on their balance. George Pullman's artificial society had stripped its citizens of every traditional safety net. They had no local charities, no independent town council to appeal to, and no political representation. They were entirely isolated, caught between a global economic collapse and a landlord who held absolute sovereignty over their employment and their shelter. The absolute paternalism that Pullman had designed to ensure eternal industrial peace had instead bred an unprecedented, concentrated rage. The workers realized that the beautiful town was not a benevolent gift. It was a highly engineered economic vacuum designed to extract their lifeblood down to the very last cent. The tension within the citadel had reached a dangerous, explosive maximum, turning the world's most perfect city into a volatile tinderbox, waiting for a single spark to ignite an industrial civil war. On the morning of May 11, 1894, an eerie, unnatural quiet fell over the massive brick workshops of Lake Calumet. For over a decade, the deafening roar of the coreless steam engine and the relentless clang of iron had formed the uninterrupted heartbeat of George Pullman's industrial empire. But on this day, the great machine was silenced. The day before, a desperate committee of workers had dared to approach management to beg for a restoration of their wages or a reduction in their rents. Not only were their pleas coldly rejected, but the company immediately fired 3 of the committee's leaders in retaliation. The fragile line between survival and starvation had finally snapped. Defying corporate rules, 3,000 workers laid down their tools, walked out of the factories, and marched into the streets. The strike had begun. Realizing they stood no chance alone against the immense financial reserves of a multi-million-dollar corporation, the desperate Pullman strikers turned to a rising force in American labor, the American Railway Union, ARU. Founded just a year prior, the ARU was led by a towering, deeply charismatic former locomotive fireman named Eugene V. Debs. Debs possessed a fierce, uncompromising belief in the collective power of the working class. Initially, he cautioned the Pullman workers against a strike, knowing that the company held every legal and economic advantage. However, as he toured the private town and witnessed the skeletal, hollow-eyed children of the workforce, his caution transformed into a burning crusade for justice. In June 1894, the ARU held its national convention in Chicago. The Pullman delegates stepped to the podium, detailing the horror of the payroll loop, the pennies left for food, and the absolute tyranny of corporate surveillance. The emotional testimony ignited the convention floor. On June 26th, the ARU unleashed a radical weapon, a total, nationwide boycott of all Pullman cars. The mechanics of the boycott were devastatingly simple and highly coordinated. Switchmen, conductors, and engineers across 27 states flatly refused to couple, move, or operate any train that carried a Pullman luxury car. If a railroad company fired a worker for refusing, the entire train crew walked off the job immediately. Within days, the entire western half of the United States was plunged into total transportation paralysis. Over 125,000 railroad workers joined the strike in solidarity. Chicago, the grand crossroads of American commerce, became the absolute epicenter of an unprecedented economic standstill. Freight trains sat dormant, livestock died in stranded cars, coal shipments ceased, and the mighty industrial network of the nation lay completely broken. The General Managers Association, GMA, a powerful cartel representing 24 major railroads, watched the spreading paralysis with absolute fury. They realized that the extraordinary solidarity of the ARU was something traditional strikebreakers could not shatter. Their losses were mounting into the millions every single day, and their corporate sovereignty was directly threatened. To break the union, they needed an ultimate, devastating lever, a force that could convert a corporate labor dispute into a grand constitutional crisis. They secretly turned their eyes away from the picket lines and toward the highest corridors of power in Washington, D.C., orchestrating a strategy that would bring the full, lethal weight of the federal government down upon their own citizens. The railroad tycoons found their perfect weapon in United States Attorney General Richard Olney, a man who still sat on the board of directors of several major railroads and held deep, unyielding corporate loyalties. Olney bypassed the local authorities and convinced President Grover Cleveland that the strike was no longer a mere labor dispute, but an illegal conspiracy obstructing the delivery of the United States mail. On July 2, 1894, Olney secured a sweeping, unprecedented federal injunction from the courts. The decree effectively outlawed the boycott, prohibiting union leaders from communicating with their members and rendering any strike activity a federal crime. Eugene V. Debs and the ARU refused to abandon the starving families of Pullman, standing firm on their moral ground despite the immense legal threat. The defiance provided the federal government with the pretext it required. On July 4, 1894, President Cleveland bypassed the governor of Illinois, John Peter Altgeld, who had strongly insisted that local authorities could handle the situation without bloodshed. thousands of heavily armed federal troops, backed by specialized cavalry and Gatling guns, marched into the heart of Chicago. The arrival of the United States Army transformed the industrial capital into an active, terrifying war zone. Regular soldiers erected fortified camps on the manicured lawns of the lakefront, their rifles loaded with live ammunition, ready to defend corporate property against American citizens. The sight of federal bayonets protecting the empty luxury cars of a billionaire tycoon while children starved in a nearby town ignited a powder keg of popular rage. Massive, chaotic riots erupted across the sprawling rail yards of Chicago. Angry crowds swelled into the tens of thousands, overturning freight cars, blocking tracks, and setting hundreds of wooden rail cars ablaze. The midnight sky over Illinois glowed an ominous, hellish orange as millions of dollars in rolling stock burned to ash. On July 7th, the inevitable tragedy occurred at the 49th Street rail yards. Surrounded by an angry, rock-throwing crowd, a contingent of soldiers panickedly opened fire directly into the civilian protesters. High-powered military bullets tore through the air. Dozens of citizens fell bleeding onto the sharp gravel of the rail beds, their lives draining away onto the very tracks they had spent their lives building. The overwhelming, brutal deployment of military force, combined with the immediate arrest and imprisonment of Eugene V. Debs for contempt of court, completely broke the back of the rebellion. By mid-July, the fires were extinguished, the smoke cleared, and the trains began to roll once more under the watchful glare of federal bayonets. The strike was utterly crushed. The shattered Pullman workers, facing absolute blacklisting and starvation, crept back to the factories on the company's unyielding terms. Their union was utterly destroyed. Their leaders were locked in prison cells, and their wages remained drastically reduced. George Pullman had won his war, successfully preserving his corporate dividends and his unbending rents. But it was a catastrophic, hollow victory. He had permanently stained his name with the blood of his own workforce, transforming his internationally celebrated industrial paradise into an eternal, terrifying monument to corporate tyranny. The smoke eventually cleared from the scorched rail yards of Chicago, and the federal troops marched away, but the psychological scars of the 1894 labor war ran permanently deep into the American psyche. George Mortimer Pullman had successfully preserved his corporate dividends and his unyielding rents, but he had utterly destroyed his own myth. He spent his remaining years walking through his massive factories, not as a celebrated industrial savior, but as a universally loathed autocrat, surrounded by a workforce that harbored a silent, burning resentment. In October 1897, less than 3 years after the military intervention, Pullman died of a sudden, catastrophic heart attack. The public animosity toward him was so profound and volatile that his family grew terrified that furious laborers would dig up his corpse and desecrate it. To prevent this, his body was buried under the cover of darkness at Chicago's Graceland Cemetery, encased inside a massive, multi-ton block of reinforced concrete and asphalt, surrounded by heavy steel rails. It was a tragic, profound irony. The ultimate master of industrial steel and luxury rail cars was permanently entombed in an impenetrable industrial fortress just to protect him from his own workers. Shortly after Pullman's death, the corporate empire suffered a devastating legal defeat that shattered its social architecture forever. In 1898, the Illinois Supreme Court delivered a landmark ruling in a long-running lawsuit against the company. The court declared that a manufacturing corporation had absolutely no constitutional authority to operate a private municipal government, act as a sovereign landlord, or control the civic lives of American citizens. The court ordered the Pullman Company to divest itself of all non-manufacturing real estate. The immaculate red brick row houses, the arcade, the market, and the streets were systematically sold off to private buyers or absorbed directly into the municipal structure of the city of Chicago. The grand utopian experiment was legally dead. The gilded cage had been torn open, leaving behind a heavily embittered, deeply unionized community that would never again trust the empty promises of corporate paternalism. Stepping into the executive vacuum left by the founder was a man carrying one of the most powerful names in American history, Robert Todd Lincoln, the eldest son of Abraham Lincoln. In a profound historical circle, the company that had launched into national prominence by transporting the martyred father's body was now governed by the son. Under Lincoln's steady, conservative presidency, the company completely abandoned its founder's social engineering fantasies and focused exclusively on aggressive commercial dominance and corporate expansion. Lincoln ruthlessly streamlined the company, enforcing an ironclad national monopoly. Through strategic acquisitions and aggressive contract negotiations, Pullman established a system where it didn't just build cars. It owned and operated virtually every single sleeping car running on every major railroad across the entire United States. If an American traveler desired to cross the continent in comfort, they had no choice but to purchase a specialized Pullman ticket. To staff this colossal, rapidly expanding fleet of rolling hotels, Robert Todd Lincoln leaned heavily on a specific, deeply vulnerable labor source: emancipated African Americans. The Pullman Company systematically became the single largest employer of black men in the United States. These men, known universally to white passengers by the degrading name George, as if they were the personal property of the dead founder, were forced to work exhausting 70-hour weeks. They endured systemic racism, low wages, and constant humiliation, relying almost entirely on the volatile tips of passengers to feed their families. Yet, out of this intense adversity, the Pullman porters forged a powerful, resilient collective identity. They became the bedrock of the rising black middle class. Under the brilliant, uncompromising leadership of labor organizer A. Philip Randolph, these workers would spend decades fighting a bitter underground war against corporate management, eventually forming the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. This historic Union victory would lay the foundational financial and organizational groundwork for the modern American civil rights movement. By the late 1920s, the financial success of the company reached its absolute historical zenith. The steady stream of corporate revenues from its nationwide monopoly seemed entirely unstoppable. In 1929, the enterprise engineered a massive corporate consolidation, merging with the Standard Steel Car Company to form a colossal manufacturing entity known as Pullman Standard. This newly formed industrial giant possessed unmatched production capabilities, boasting massive, state-of-the-art facilities not only in Chicago, but also in the industrial heartland of Butler, Pennsylvania. On paper, the Pullman Standard empire looked completely invincible. Its balance sheets were pristine, its dividends were highly secure, and its factories were sprawling monuments to American mechanical supremacy. But this absolute dominance bred a fatal, insidious corporate arrogance. The executive leadership became deeply rigid, structuring their entire long-term strategy around a 19th century vision of heavy steel rails and steam locomotives. They failed to realize that the world outside their boardrooms was accelerating at an unprecedented pace. Beneath the surface of their massive financial numbers, alternative technologies, advanced internal combustion engines, commercial aviation concepts, and high-speed long-distance road networks were quietly maturing in the background. The industrial giant was immensely strong, but it was rapidly losing its agility, setting the stage for a catastrophic collision with a modern world it was totally unprepared to navigate. As the smoke of global conflict engulfed Europe and Asia in the late 1930s, the underlying structural vulnerabilities of the American railroad industry were abruptly masked by a gargantuan wave of state-sponsored militarization. The onset of World War II did not merely rescue the domestic economy from the lingering malaise of the Great Depression. It injected a violent, artificial surge of life into the heavy manufacturing sectors. For the newly consolidated Pullman Standard Car Manufacturing Company, the onset of total war offered an unparalleled opportunity to demonstrate its raw industrial muscle. The corporate giant abruptly pivoted from catering to the whims of wealthy Gilded Age descendants to serving as a critical pillar of the global Allied war machine. The transition from civilian manufacturing to military mobilization was nothing short of miraculous. The sprawling manufacturing complexes of Pullman Standard, most notably the historic nucleus near Lake Calumet in Chicago and the massive high-capacity steel fabrication facility in Butler, Pennsylvania, underwent a near-overnight structural metamorphosis. The precise assembly lines that had spent decades meticulously shaping polished walnut panels, fine upholstery, and delicate brass light fixtures for luxury sleeping cars were ruthlessly stripped away. In their place, heavy machinery, high-powered hydraulic presses, and industrial welding bays were installed to handle the massive, unyielding requirements of military ordnance. Between 1941 and 1945, the factories of Pullman Standard transformed into absolute powerhouses within the legendary arsenal of democracy. The sheer diversity and volume of their wartime output stunned military logistics experts. In Butler, Pennsylvania, the workers manipulated massive sheets of rolled steel to produce hundreds of thousands of high-explosive artillery shells and heavy bomb casings, operating under a relentless 24-hour production cycle. In Chicago, the company's legendary engineering divisions adapted their structural expertise to construct complex aeronautical components, turning out massive, durable wing assemblies for Douglas C-47 Skytrain cargo planes. Most astonishingly, Pullman Standard even ventured into naval warfare. Utilizing an innovative modular prefabrication technique borrowed from their railcar assembly methods, the landlocked Chicago facility manufactured dozens of steel-hulled patrol craft escort vessels. These large naval ships were systematically launched into Lake Calumet, sailed down the Chicago River, and eventually sent down the Mississippi River to join the desperate battle against German U-boats in the Atlantic Ocean. For the American military personnel traversing the vast domestic expanses before deployment overseas, the company engineered a highly specialized vehicle, the Pullman Troop Sleeper. Stripped of all traditional opulence, these utilitarian dark green steel boxes were designed with triple-tiered bunk beds to maximize passenger density. Over 80% of all mass troop movements within the United States during the war were executed aboard these specialized cars. On paper, the corporate ledger was a monument to absolute triumph. Pullman Standard was flooded with lucrative, guaranteed government contracts. Its employment figures surged to historic highs, and corporate profits soared to levels unseen since the Roaring '20s. Yet this magnificent display of industrial supremacy was a profound and deeply seductive optical illusion. The staggering wartime revenues and the patriotic fervor sweeping through the factories concealed a fatal, creeping institutional rot. Because every single ounce of steel, rubber, and human labor was completely monopolized by the war effort, the domestic civilian rail infrastructure was forced into a state of total, uncompensated neglect. For 4 continuous years, locomotives and passenger cars across the nation were run ragged, operating at maximum capacity without proper maintenance, parts replacement, or structural upgrades. Worse still, the executive leadership at Pullman Standard fundamentally misinterpreted this forced, wartime reliance on rail transport as a permanent guarantee of post-war market dominance. Flush with state cash, the board of directors failed to notice that their future executioners were quietly evolving. The frantic exigencies of global conflict were driving unprecedented, revolutionary advancements in long-distance heavy aviation and mass-production automotive technologies. While Pullman's machinery ran day and night to build specialized steel boxes for a 19th-century transport network, competitor industries were mastering the mass assembly of modern aluminum aircraft and high-speed combustion engines. The company was burning through its physical assets and mechanical capital to secure short-term, militarized profits, completely blind to the fact that the moment peace returned to the world, the entire American landscape would be violently and permanently altered. For generations, the executive board of the Pullman Company operated under a comforting yet deeply hazardous illusion of total immortality. They had successfully weathered the catastrophic labor rebellions of the 19th century by leveraging the brutal military intervention of the federal government. They had converted a global war into a fountain of unprecedented corporate revenue, running their massive assembly lines 24 hours a day to supply the Allied war machine. By the late 1940s, Pullman's absolute monopoly over the American rails appeared to be an unassailable law of nature. But while the company's factories were running at maximum capacity, a silent existential predator was quietly sharpening its knives in the antitrust divisions of Washington, D.C. The very federal government that had once acted as Pullman's iron fist was about to transform into its ultimate executioner. The opening blow of this quiet, devastating corporate civil war landed in 1940 when the United States Department of Justice filed a sweeping, monumental antitrust lawsuit against Pullman Incorporated. The government's accusation was clear, precise, and structurally devastating. Pullman had created an unlawful, suffocating chokehold on American transportation. The company did not merely dominate the market, it completely erased the possibility of competition through a ruthless, multi-layered vertical monopoly. To understand the absolute nature of this monopoly, one must look at how Pullman closed the loop on the entire industry. The manufacturing arm built the palace cars, but the service arm owned and operated them. Pullman signed ironclad, exclusive service contracts with every major railroad across the nation. Under these restrictive agreements, if a railroad wanted to offer premium sleeping car services to its passengers, it was legally forbidden from purchasing passenger cars from any independent manufacturer, such as the innovative Budd Company or the American Car and Foundry Company. Furthermore, Pullman insisted on total operational control. The company built the cars, leased them back to the railroads, and flooded the trains with its own highly exploited army of conductors and porters. If an innovative competitor designed a lighter, faster, or more modern passenger car, they found themselves completely locked out of the American rail network. Pullman had effectively converted the nation's public infrastructure into a private, highly lucrative kingdom. The bitter legal warfare ground on for 7 exhausting years, aggressively contested by a corporate legal team accustomed to dictating terms to the courts. But the era of Gilded Age corporate immunity had permanently drawn to a close. In 1947, the federal courts delivered a definitive, shattering ruling that shattered the foundational architecture of the empire. The court declared Pullman's dual identity as both a manufacturer and an operator to be an illegal restraint of trade. The corporate leadership was handed an uncompromising, brutal ultimatum. They must immediately bisect the empire. The court ruled that the company could no longer act as both the landlord and the builder. It had to completely divest itself of either its highly profitable sleeping car service operations or its massive heavy manufacturing division. Facing this agonizing structural fracture, the board of directors made a short-sighted, catastrophic mathematical calculation that permanently sealed their long-term doom. They elected to preserve the heavy industrial machinery, clinging to the manufacturing division known as Pullman Standard. Concurrently, they sold their massive, historic fleet of sleeping cars and the entire operational service network to a massive consortium of 57 individual American railroad companies for approximately $40 million. On paper, the massive cash influx from the sale made the corporate balance sheet appear temporarily magnificent, but the structural damage to the enterprise was immediate and fatal. By severing the service division, Pullman Standard had effectively amputated its own financial heart. For generations, the steady, predictable, and virtually recession-proof stream of revenues generated by passenger service fees had acted as a vital economic cushion. When the volatile manufacturing market experienced sudden downturns, the service division consistently kept the corporate treasury flush with liquid cash. Overnight, that legendary cushion vanished. Pullman Standard was abruptly cast out into the biting cold of the open competitive market. They were no longer an all-powerful, self-sustaining empire. They were converted into a vulnerable, naked manufacturer, forced to aggressively bid for individual contracts against hungry, highly innovative competitors who were not weighed down by decades of industrial hubris. Worse still, the timing of this forced legal fracture could not have been more disastrous. Pullman Standard was cast adrift into a highly volatile post-war marketplace at the exact moment the traditional American railroad industry was about to enter a terrifying, irreversible tailspin. The iron tracks that had carried the company to global glory were beginning to clear out as the eyes of the nation turned away from the rails and toward the open sky. The late 1940s and early 1950s brought a radiant, unprecedented economic boom to post-war America, but it was a prosperity that fundamentally turned its back on the iron tracks. As millions of soldiers returned home with government-backed loans and newly formed families, a profound psychological and cultural shift swept across the nation. The collective desire for fixed collective schedules was replaced by an obsession with absolute personal autonomy and speed. This cultural transformation found its ultimate expression in two rising industrial titans: the mass-produced family automobile and commercial aviation. For Pullman Standard, stripped of its protective service monopoly and cast out into the open market, this shifting landscape marked the beginning of an irreversible, agonizing decline. The first mortal blow to passenger rail dominance came from the asphalt ribbon of the open road. Under the administration of President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the federal government embarked on the construction of the Interstate Highway System, a monumental public works project that poured billions of tax dollars into paving thousands of miles of high-speed concrete highways across the continent. Simultaneously, Detroit's automotive assembly lines turned out millions of affordable, modern vehicles every year. The American middle class no longer needed to purchase an expensive train ticket or share a sleeping compartment with strangers. They could simply pack their own cars and drive anywhere at their own pace. The romance of the rails was rapidly eclipsed by the convenience of the suburban garage. Concurrently, an even more lethal threat materialized in the skies overhead. The aviation technology matured during World War II rapidly translated into a booming commercial airline industry. In the early 1950s, sleek, propeller-driven airliners, soon to be replaced by the revolutionary jet age, began crisscrossing the American atmosphere. A transcontinental journey that once required 3 days of continuous travel aboard a luxury Pullman train could now be executed in a matter of mere hours inside a pressurized aluminum cabin. For corporate executives, politicians, and the wealthy elite, the historical bedrock of Pullman's premium customer base, the choice was immediate. They abandoned the rails for the sky, viewing the passenger train not as an icon of luxury, but as an archaic, slow relic of a bygone century. The impact on America's railroads was immediate and catastrophic. Passenger ridership plummeted at a terrifying velocity. Legacy railroad companies, forced by federal regulations to maintain unprofitable passenger routes, began losing hundreds of millions of dollars every single year. To stem the financial bleeding, railroads desperately cut back on their services, canceling historic routes, and completely halting their purchases of new passenger equipment. Pullman Standard's once boundless order book withered to almost nothing. The company that had once manufactured thousands of elite palace cars annually found itself scrambling for single-digit orders from broke, or broke, desperate clients. This relentless economic starvation reached a heartbreaking, symbolic climax in 1955. The original historic Pullman manufacturing nucleus near Lake Calumet in Chicago, the magnificent red brick utopian citadel erected by George Pullman in 1880, could no longer withstand the crushing weight of the post-war reality. With zero demand for new sleeping cars and massive overhead costs, the executive board made the painful decision to permanently shut down the historic passenger car assembly operations at the Chicago plant. The massive workshops that had birthed the Gilded Age survived the bloodiest labor wars of the 19th century and manufactured the fleets that won World War II, fell permanently silent. The closure was a devastating psychological fracture for the community. Generations of proud, highly skilled craftsmen were cast aside, their specialized labor rendered obsolete by a changing world that valued disposable speed over enduring craftsmanship. The slow bleed of the rails was no longer a corporate abstraction debated in corporate boardrooms. It was a visible, haunting reality etched across the American landscape. Across the nation, rows of once magnificent steel Pullman cars were systematically decommissioned, shunted onto forgotten desert sidings and overgrown rail yards to rot under the sun. Dust slowly settled over the fine velvet cushions. Spiders spun webs across the polished walnut mirrors, and the steady, rhythmic click-clack of the tracks grew fainter and fainter, as an entire empire slowly dissolved into the gathering shadows of industrial irrelevance. By the late 1970s, the landscape of American industrial manufacturing was bleeding from 1,000 cuts. A devastating combination of soaring inflation, crippling energy crises, and aggressive foreign competition had pushed once iconic domestic conglomerates to the absolute brink of insolvency. For Pullman Standard, operating without the reliable luxury passenger car market that had historically insulated its treasury, survival required a desperate, absolute pivot. The company completely abandoned its historic identity as a purveyor of Gilded Age luxury and transformed into a high-volume builder of state-subsidized transit equipment. They aggressively pursued massive municipal contracts, seeking to build commuter rail cars, subway systems, and bi-level coaches for a new generation of public transit authorities. The crowning achievement of this final, frantic era materialized in an extraordinary contract with Amtrak, the federally funded passenger railroad service. Amtrak ordered a massive, revolutionary fleet of double-decker passenger coaches known as the Superliners. These colossal steel cars were designed to redefine long-distance cross-country travel for modern Americans, featuring panoramic lounge cars, spacious dining facilities, and advanced sleeping compartments. The production of the Superliners breathed a final, electrifying surge of life into the historic manufacturing lines. Engineers and steelworkers labored under punishing schedules, pouring their multi-generational expertise into welding the massive double-decker frames. On paper, the delivery of the Superliner fleet in the late 1970s looked like a triumphant rebirth, proving that Pullman Standard still possessed the mechanical supremacy to shape the nation's transportation infrastructure. But the operational reality behind the factory gates was a terrifying, unsustainable financial nightmare. The Superliner contract, plagued by severe engineering delays, sudden design modifications, and runaway material costs, yielded almost zero net profit for the corporation. The company was burning through millions of dollars in liquid capital just to keep the assembly lines moving, burdened by massive aging factories that required staggering maintenance overhead. Recognizing the impending structural collapse, the executive board sought an outside buyer. In 1980, the industrial conglomerate Wheelabrator Fry executed a massive buyout. absorbing the entire Pullman empire into its corporate portfolio. The new management arrived with a ruthless, unsentimental mandate: eliminate underperforming assets, slash operational costs, and aggressively restructure the corporate architecture to satisfy Wall Street investors. The corporate raiders fundamentally viewed the century-old railcar manufacturing tradition not as a legendary American heritage, but as a bleeding financial liability. Their darkest fears were realized in 1981, when a sudden, devastating macroeconomic recession slammed into the heavy freight sector. Orders for new freight cars and transit equipment evaporated across the continent over a single quarter. Wheelabrator Fry found themselves holding a massive, cash-starved industrial giant that was losing millions of dollars a week. The new owners realized that incremental cost-cutting would no longer suffice to protect their profit margins. They began quietly preparing a sudden corporate execution that would permanently sever the company's physical existence and destroy the livelihoods of the last remaining industrial communities that depended on the Pullman name. The final catastrophic blow fell not in the urban sprawl of Chicago, but in the tight-knit industrial valley of Butler, Pennsylvania. Since the corporate consolidation of 1929, the massive Butler facility had served as the high-capacity, heavy steel beating heart of Pullman Standard's manufacturing empire. Generations of local families had walked through those factory gates, forging a profound collective identity around the pride of heavy industrial labor. The factory didn't merely provide employment, it was the absolute economic and social anchor of the entire region. In early 1982, without any advance warning or opportunity for union negotiation, the executive leadership of Wheelabrator Fry issued a cold, sudden press release. They announced the immediate permanent closure of the Butler manufacturing plant. The execution was absolute. Over 2,500 highly skilled steel workers and mechanics were locked out of their workplace over a single night. The psychological shockwave tore through the community with devastating force. Men who had given 30 years of loyal service to the corporation stood outside the frozen iron gates in the bitter winter air, staring blankly at the padlocks. They were cast out into a collapsing job market with zero safety nets, their specialized skills rendered completely worthless by a corporate stroke of a pen. The economic devastation radiating from the empty factory floor completely hollowed out the region. Within months, Main Street businesses that had thrived for decades went bankrupt as the local purchasing power vanished. Schools lost their funding, tax bases collapsed, and thousands of families were forced to pack their belongings and abandon their ancestral homes, joining a desperate diaspora of displaced workers searching for survival in a rapidly deindustrializing America. Butler, Pennsylvania was permanently transformed into a textbook casualty of the Rust Belt era, a landscape defined by hollowed-out towns, skyrocketing suicide rates, and the silent, heavy despair of a forgotten working class. The physical assets of the empire were systematically cannibalized. In 1987, after letting the vacant manufacturing facilities gather rust for 5 long years, Wheelabrator Fry sold the remaining designs, patents, and manufacturing assets of Pullman Standard to the Canadian transit giant Bombardier. The transaction was a quiet, unceremonious funeral for an industrial colossus. Bombardier absorbed Pullman's legendary patents to build up its own global transit presence, while the physical factories in America were abandoned to the elements or torn down for scrap metal. The absolute silence that settled over the massive empty workshops marked the definitive, physical end of the Pullman industrial lineage. The great industrial titan that had once commanded an absolute monopoly over American transport, deployed armies of workers, and built the rolling fortresses that won world wars, had been utterly erased from the global economy, liquidated by corporate managers who prioritized short-term balance sheets over human lives. Today, a profound, heavy silence hangs over the remaining brick facades of the Lake Calumet Industrial Complex in Chicago and the vacant, cracked foundations of the valley in Butler, Pennsylvania. where the monumental coreless steam engine once shook the earth and thousands of hammers forged the physical symbols of Gilded Age wealth, wild weeds now fracture the concrete. The towering smokestacks, which once choked the Illinois sky with the black smoke of nonstop production, stand as hollow monuments to an obsolete era. The physical empire of George Mortimer Pullman has been systematically ground down by time and corporate liquidation, leaving behind only the structural ghosts of a collapsed industrial lineage. Yet, the story of the Pullman Company did not end with the closing of the factory gates or the selling of its mechanical patents to foreign conglomerates. In a striking historical turn, the pristine, red-brick town that George Pullman engineered as an instrument of absolute corporate surveillance has been preserved. Designated as a United States National Monument, the historic Pullman District now welcomes visitors from around the world. They do not come to marvel at the flawless capitalist utopia the founder envisioned, nor do they come to celebrate his paternalistic benevolence. Instead, they walk these tree-lined boulevards to study a profound cautionary tale of corporate hubris, industrial autocracy, and the unyielding resilience of the human spirit. The enduring legacy of Pullman is defined by a supreme historical irony. George Pullman invested his immense fortune and engineering genius to build a strike-proof citadel, explicitly designed to strip his workforce of their collective leverage and enforce absolute submission to corporate profit. But his structural tyranny achieved the exact opposite. By squeezing his workers within the intolerable loop of the payroll trap, he inadvertently catalyzed the modern American labor movement and transformed the national consciousness. The blood spilled on the sharp gravel of the Chicago railbeds in the summer of 1894 did not wash away in vain. The catastrophic violence forced the federal government to confront the explosive realities of unregulated industrial capitalism. In a direct attempt to appease a deeply fractured nation immediately following the strike, President Grover Cleveland signed the legislation establishing Labor Day as a national holiday, forever cementing the memory of the working class into the American calendar. Furthermore, the subterranean warfare waged by the Pullman porters under the brilliant organization of A. Philip Randolph left an indelible mark on the global social fabric. Their decades-long struggle against the company's entrenched institutional racism did not merely secure fair wages, it established the foundational economic infrastructure, leadership networks, and tactical models that would directly launch the modern American civil rights movement. The fight for human dignity on the luxury cars of the 20th century directly paved the way for the historic marches that transformed constitutional equality across the globe. Ultimately, the true diadem of the Pullman saga is not found in the velvet-lined palace cars, the gold-leaf chandeliers, or the millions of dollars in corporate dividends that once flooded the company's treasuries. Those physical assets have systematically decayed into rust and scrap metal. The real permanent inheritance of this industrial empire is written in the legal protections, fair wage standards, and collective bargaining rights enjoyed by millions of modern workers worldwide. The industrial citadel is broken, the sovereign landlord is dead, and the steel giants have vanished from the rails. But the echoes of the 12,000 souls who dared to challenge an omnipotent corporate empire still reverberate through every modern workshop, serving as an eternal reminder that human dignity can never be permanently incarcerated within a gilded cage. The epic rise and catastrophic fall of the Pullman Company leaves behind a sobering blueprint of industrial history. It stands as a timeless reminder that no monopoly is too vast to collapse, and no corporate citadel is completely strike-proof. George Pullman's fatal error was never a failure of mechanical engineering or logistics. It was a fundamental failure of empathy. He viewed human beings as mere components in a flawlessly calculated financial machine, believing that manicured lawns and brick row houses could substitute for basic human liberty and fair compensation. When the system fractured under economic pressure, the board chose to protect dividends over people, setting off a chain reaction that ultimately invited the antitrust acts of the federal government and the unyielding erosion of technological obsolescence. As the remaining physical structures rot into the soil of Chicago and Butler, the true lesson of the Pullman saga outlives the rust. It proves that any economic or industrial system that systematically disregards the human element builds its foundation on sand. The grand fortunes of the Gilded Age have evaporated into thin air, and the once glorious palace cars have been reduced to scrap metal. Yet the legal protections, the dignity of the modern work week, and the organizational roots of constitutional equality endure as the true permanent inheritance of this fallen giant. What do you think was the definitive turning point in the undoing of the Pullman Empire? Was it the moral stain of the 1894 labor war, or the leadership's rigid refusal to adapt to the rising skies of the aviation age? Share your perspective in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into industrial history insightful, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to support our mission of uncovering the complex truths behind the world's greatest corporate collapses. Thank you for watching,